Hey folks, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we're just going to paint a model. It's been a while since I just sat down and painted. I've done a lot of videos where I've shared thoughts and opinions, and I've done a lot of videos where we did some hobby space cleanup. It's been a while since we painted a model, and let's just paint one. Jumping straight into the mix now, typically I would paint everything on screen in front of you guys. However, I actually use this miniature as a test mini during a live stream to show how I would paint different kinds of fabric. I was actually really happy with the way the cloak turned out, and I really didn't want to repaint it. I wanted to design a paint scheme that kind of went around this cloak and the zenithal highlight that I already had on it. So I set out to use this as a challenge for myself. Now, if you're interested in knowing what colors I use to blend up these greens, I started with Stegodon Scale Green as my absolute deepest shadow, moving into Wog Flesh, moving into Warpstone Glow, and then finishing off with Moot Green. Now, in a few places where I wanted some extreme bright greens, I did go ahead and add some Uriel Yellow into my Moot Green, but I used that very sparingly. Now, it was important for me to go ahead and play off the zenithal highlight that I had already done here. I wanted to give this a bit of a dynamic, almost zenithal kind of feeling to it. There's a few places where I don't necessarily follow the lighting convention and I highlight some stuff anyway, but that's just because I wanted the miniature to feel a little bit more colorful when I'm using it in D&D. Now, something to keep in mind as I'm painting this miniature is I knew that I wanted this very zenithal highlight to show through, where the darkest shadows were going to be on that shield hand and the brightest highlights were going to be on that sword hand. However, I wanted to give it a little bit of a heroic feel and add some highlights in places that don't 100% make sense, as I feel this makes the miniature look a little bit more colorful and works really great for a D&D universe, which is what this miniature is going to get used for. I typically don't do this when I paint Warhammer figures and I go for a little bit more of a realistic approach, or I go for a midday approach where all of my highlights are directly from above. But for my D&D figures, I always try to give them a little bit more dynamic lighting. For Caucasian skin tones, I pretty much use the exact same two paints regardless. I use Bugman's Glow as a base, and then I layer up with Kislov with some of my Bugmans mixed in, usually in about a 50-50, and then my extreme highlights are just pure Kislov flesh. Now, when I want the character to look like they've been out in the sun a little bit more, I tend to use Guilliman Flesh as my wash to kind of blend everything together. Now, Guilliman's Flesh is a contrast paint, so you can cut it with a little bit of water, or you can just paint it on really thin and not let it pool as much. Typically, I would use a Reikland Flesh shade for most skin tones, but again, when I want them to look like they've been out in the sun, or perhaps maybe there's a little bit more dirt and grime on them, like they've been out on the trail a little more, that's when I'll use my Guilliman's Flesh tone, and I think it does a lot to really darken the skin tone as well as give it a real natural appearance. Now, depending upon how much experience you have in miniature painting, that may affect the way that you look at painting skin tones, and they're really not that complicated. I know some people get really freaked out by them, but as long as you leave a little bit of that wash in those deepest recesses and in the cracks of the detail on the face, it goes a very long way to selling the realism as well as bringing in warmth into that skin tone. As I continued painting the miniature, I realized there was a few highlights that hadn't really been pushed to the point where I really wanted them, as well as I wasn't quite happy with the ruffles on this like kilt thing that he's wearing. I felt like it needed to have a little bit more punch down around the edges, so I went ahead and added a bit of a edge highlight by mixing in some Uriel Yellow, like I said earlier, to create an extreme highlight, and I just took that almost all the way around the edge on this kilt thing, and that was really enough to make me satisfied. And then I moved on to doing the armor. So I originally wanted to do actually red armor, and I was contemplating back and forth on whether I wanted to paint red and to build up all the highlights in a non-metallic metallic style of painting, which is something I've never done, plus the fact that I'm also colorblind to red. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, and I quickly came across that, and I decided I was going to go ahead and build up my highlights through the metallics and work with colors that I could see, mainly silvers and grays and gunmetal type colors, and build up almost in a zenithal like fashion, and then the plan was to put contrast paints over that. And then I kind of watched a few other videos of people doing similar things, and the final result was good, but it just wasn't quite there. So I thought, well, I'll just keep tweaking and mess with things, and I'll make sure my shadows are extreme and my highlights are extreme, and that good contrast between the two should probably work out pretty well for when I go to put on my contrast paints. And then as I continued to push forward with that idea, I really started falling in love with how the silver armor looked, and I was getting such a nice volume between the darks and the brights, and I was getting the contrast just kind of where I really wanted it, and it just kind of worked. And I decided that I would be ruining it and doing it a disservice if I put the red wash over it like I had planned to. So we ended up going with the silver armor, which means I now needed to come up with a plan for how I was going to accent it. And with plans to use red on other places in the model, I figured gold would be a good complement to that and would really aid the red where I was going to be using it, especially considering how sparing I was planning to use it. And now that I've gone on enough about how much I like the silver, let's talk about how I achieved it. So I started with gunmetal, and I did that as an all over. I wasn't quite happy with how dark it was, so I added a little bit of black in. Honestly, any black would work just fine. I happen to use some black ink, which dries a little bit glossy, so you might want to go with a glossy black. I then mixed in Shining Silver from Army Painter to my midtone of Gunmetal, and then just used a pure Shining Silver as my extreme highlights. And that's all it took to achieve the silver. And we'll talk about the gold later on when I go ahead and paint it. That ends up being one of the last details, so we'll talk about it then. Now I have a recipe that I always use for bone and claws and things, and I don't know why I didn't just stick to it this time. I wanted to do something different and try to get a little extra pop of detail, and it just didn't work. So I'm gonna tell you my method that does work, and just kind of ignore what I'm doing on screen. It had good intentions, but it didn't work. So you're going to start with something like XV88 or Tolerant Sand, and then you're going to dry brush a white color. I tend to use Wraithbone, and then you're going to glaze Wraithbone at the very tips of the horn, and that's going to give you a very subtle but smooth transition from your darkest dark into your brightest white. Then you're going to go back in with some kind of a dark color, whether it be brown or black, right up next to the base of the horns, and you're going to go very sparingly around the rim of the horn, and then with a damp, clean brush, you're going to feather that out. You're basically doing a wet blend without any paint on the brush. You're just using the paint that you just put onto the horn as your paint to kind of wet blend between the water on your brush and the paint that's already on the model. That's kind of a good way to feather out small details like that. Working on the leather now, I'm using my go-to. It's a contrast paint. It's Gorgunta Fur, I believe is how you pronounce it, and I pretty much use this for anything that's going to be leather or anything that I want to be wood on this miniature. And the only real piece of wood is the handle for the sword, and it pretty much all gets the same treatment. Normally I would go back in and add some details and do some weathering and things like that, but with this being a D&D figure, I don't think it needs to be super over the top. Most of the miniature is already pretty clean anyway, so I don't see the point in doing tons of weathering on something when I'm not going to do weathering on everything else. So one good clean pass of this, and once you're happy with the color, call it a day on the leather. And now we're finally to doing the golds. Now most of this is on the sword. There's very little around the rest of the miniature, but I actually didn't use any gold. I used Rough Iron by Army Painter, which is kind of a bronzy color, and again by Army Painter I used True Copper. Now I did mix these 50-50 to kind of get a mid-tone, which I didn't use too tremendously, and it's mostly just the copper on its own for the brightest highlights. I didn't use any gold color. It actually turned out really wonderful. I thought I was going to have to mix a bit of gold into this to get my final result, but honestly I think it looks great without it. Now I do the exact same thing over on the shield, and although I could have gone a little bit all out on the shield and made it look enchanted, not every adventurer is going to be walking around with enchanted gear, so I thought I'd just leave well enough alone. In addition to finishing off the sword, which just took me forever to get it to a point where I was happy with it, I just went ahead and finished off all the little details I missed. The little pins that hold the cape onto the armor, the little ploof that comes out of the top of the helmet, the hair on the figure, which there's very little of, but I kind of went for this dirty blonde look. Now, the little ploof, the little plume that comes out of the top of the helmet, that is Averland Sunset and some Wild Rider Red kind of mixed together. Nothing too crazy, and I did the same thing for all the little bits and bobs that are red on the rest of the armor. And again, I'm just kind of going around and I'm looking for little details, things where I maybe want things to be a little sharper or a little bit more contrast. I'm kind of going back in with colors that I've already used, and I'm just kind of picking things out and cleaning up some line work. And that's pretty much about it. Honestly, I really love how this turned out. The only thing that I could care less about is the horns. I might go ahead and repaint those once this video is uploaded and done with, and if I do that, then I will go ahead and upload a picture of it to the community feed so you guys can see the updated horns. But probably knowing me, I'm just going to leave well enough alone. We're going to be going over to my tried and true method for doing cobblestones. Now, I do this on all of my Age of Sigmar figures, as a lot of them come with those really nice sculpted bases. And we're just going to hit everything with a lightly watered down Scavenge Blight Dinge. This is going to help it kind of soak in. It's also going to help that Zenithal highlight kind of show through, be a little speckly, and kind of give that stone texture that we want. And then we're going to use a lightly watered down version of 3 colors just to pick out some of the stones while the dinge is still wet. So we're going to be using Talaran Sand, we're going to be using Dawnstone, and we're going to be using Fenrisian Gray. Now, you don't have to use Fenrisian Gray as it's got some blue to it. You might want to use some other earth tones if you want a more natural appearance. But I think the Fenrisian Gray kind of really adds a little pop of color and really helps with that fantasy vibe. If you're looking for a more realistic earth tones, you may want to skip out on the Fenrisian Gray and use some other washes like Fugan Orange and things like that that will help to simulate kind of like ore deposits within the rock, as rock can be different colors depending on what types of ore are in it or were around it at the time it was mined. So just keep that in mind when it comes to how you're wanting to decorate your bases. But those are the colors that I use. I feel it really looks amazing, especially once you put some weathering powders on it for a more realistic look. But again, in this case with this miniature, I'm going for a high fantasy look, so we're keeping things pretty clean. I really like how it turned out, and the little plants that are on it, I use the exact same colors I used for the green fabric in the same order, so we won't have to cover that again. And there we have it, the Green Knight is done. Thank you guys so much for watching today, I really appreciate it, and so sorry it has taken so long to get another episode out. I've been really struggling with getting motivation and getting energy. I've been on all kinds of new medication recently for blood pressure and a whole bunch of other stuff, and it's just kind of been a nightmare to get back into the swing of things. Even kind of remembering how I used to set up the camera and stuff has just kind of been me fumbling around and refiguring things out again. Hopefully I can get back into the swing of things and start putting out content on a more regular basis again, because I've really missed it and I had a lot of fun working on this guy. In any case, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you guys in the next one. As always, if you got any ideas for future videos, go ahead and leave them in the comments down below. And until next time, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Hey, thanks for watching until the end of the video. Just real quick, I have a crap ton of these left over from when I owned my game store, and I'm thinking about using them as a way to practice non-metallic metal. And I have no idea if that's a process that you guys would like to see. With me being colorblind, it's very difficult for me to do. I've probably got about 200 of those sprues, so there should be plenty for me to at least get in the ballpark, hopefully, for non-metallic metal. And if that is something you are interested in seeing me learn how to do, then I will both do it as a series of live streams as well as update videos along the way. Now, in addition to that, many of you have asked me to do a 24-hour painting challenge where I paint up an entire start collecting box inside of 24 hours and to see how far I can get. Now, I've got a few more models to go along with this box, so I'm thinking about turning it into a 48-hour painting challenge and seeing how far I can get in 24 and then how much farther I can take it in 48. So let me know if that's something you guys are interested in. In addition to that, we're going to be doing a Candyland inspired gaming table, and I am still coming up with all the themes for all the little bits of scatter terrain. So if you've got ideas for any of that stuff or something that sounds fun that you'd like to see me attempt to do, or maybe you have an idea for a table you want to do but you're not sure how to execute it, go ahead and put it in the comments below, and if I decide to make a video on it, then you'll have a tutorial or at least a jumping off point for where you can pick up on your own stuff. In any case, thanks so much for watching to the end, guys. I'll see you in the next one.